Hello, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium for August 5th, 2019, and the Mo Bible podcast. Today is going to be sort of a shorter, more analytical essay where we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the flood. Now, given that I have a really busy day today, I didn't really have a lot of time to record this episode, and I have to make preparations to move back into my dormitory this week so that I can start back on my senior year of college. Today is going to be mostly an episode focused on research and presenting research, and admittedly, this is just going to be sort of a quick primer of certain things I've been able to collect about the flood of Noah. So there's a couple different questions that we could ask ourselves about the flood of Noah. The first of one, the first of many being, did the flood actually happen? You hear this a lot. There's sort of an ongoing debate between, well, I mean, I call it ongoing, but it's pretty much dead at this point. People have decided what they're going to believe. But you have these sort of generally evangelical um, people. They're generally referred to as, say, fundamentalists or something like that. And they believe in a literal interpretation, like literal interpretation of Genesis 7. So, what they believe is that there was a literal flood that covered the entire earth in water, and that literally everything was destroyed except for the people and the animals inside of the ark. Um, this interpretation has a lot of problems, as you may know. For example, um, the geological record does not seem to support such a catastrophic flood. Also, there probably is not enough water on the face of the earth to cover the entire planet to the extent that is described in the biblical narrative. But that's okay. We don't have to be so caught up in sort of a literal interpretation of Genesis 7, especially because that interpretation is a literal interpretation of English translations of Genesis 7. So if you'll notice, and of course I'm going to have a lot of links in the description of this video, but if you'll notice, in the article that I'm going to link to from Catholic Answers, they talk about how the Hebrew word for earth that is used in the narrative can also be translated as land. So when they talk about the earth being covered by the waters, they literally mean the land is covered by the waters, which could mean several different things. It could, I admit, potentially mean that all the land on the face of the earth is covered by water, or potentially not mean that. So I think we've got to, not multiply. There's sort of a principle in theology and exegesis that you shouldn't multiply miracles. It's sort of like an Occam's razor thing, but for miracles. So I'm going to generally abide by that and say that, in general, I think we can agree that geologically speaking, the flood was not universal in the sense that it did not cover the entirety of the globe. But was it anthropologically universal? And I think in that respect we have to say yes. And what I mean by this is that in the flood narrative, it says that all men except for those in the ark perished in the flood. Well, that does seem far fetched at first. A couple of reasons for this is that given what we know about human migratory patterns, this would presumably put the time of the deluge very far back in the geological record. And of course, I'm not an expert in um, human migration in the prehistoric period, but I do know that human beings had migrated pretty far by the time most people put the events of the flood of Genesis. But at the same time, we have sort of the circumstantial evidence that pretty much all cultures I think the article that I'm going to link to lists 67 different cultures that have flood narratives. Most of these are in the Middle East, but there's also um, cultures in North America, for example, and in parts of Asia that also have what we would consider to be myths or narratives that correspond to the Noahic flood. So it would seem circumstantially, at least, that there was some sort of event that inspired all of these different myths, and they all have similar elements. That being that, a god gets angry or something and wants to flood the planet, or the planet is flooded for whatever reason, and some contingent of people is saved in a vessel of some kind. So that being the question, then, what can we say about the anthropological universality of the flood? So I'm going to quote from the Catholic Answers article that I have linked down there. He says, "Science, therefore, may demand an early date for the deluge, but it does not necessitate a limitation of the flood to certain parts of the human race. The question whether all men perished in the deluge must be decided by the teaching of the Bible and of its authoritative interpreter. As to the teachings of the Bible, the passage which deals ex professo with the flood, that is, Genesis 6 through 9, if taken by itself, may be interpreted of a partial destruction of man. It insists on the fact that all inhabitants of the "land" and not of the "earth" died in the waters of the deluge, and it does not explicitly tell us whether all men lived in the "land." It may also be granted that of the passages which refer incidentally to the flood, Wisdom 10, verse 4, Wisdom chapter 14, verse 6, Ecclesiastes, um, various chapters in Ecclesiastes and in Matthew and so forth, they may be explained more or less satisfactorily of a partial destruction of the human race by the inundation of the deluge. But no one can deny that the prima facie meaning of First Peter chapter 3 verse 20, as well as Second Peter chapter 2 verses 4 through 9, and Second Peter chapter 3 verse 5 refers to the death of all men not contained in the ark. And again, I'm not going to read those passages because it would be there's a lot there. So I recommend you guys to go and check out those passages for yourself. The explanation of these passages offered by the opponents of the anthropological universality of the deluge are hardly sufficient to remove all reasonable doubt. We turn therefore to authority in order to arrive at a final settlement of the question. Here we are confronted in brief with the following facts. Up to the 16th and 17th centuries, the belief in the anthropological universality of the deluge was general. Moreover, the Fathers regarded the ark and the flood as types of baptism and of the Church. This view they entertained not as a private opinion, but as the development of the doctrine contained in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Hence, the typical character of both the ark and the flood belongs to the "matters of faith and morals," in which the Tridentine and Vatican councils oblige all Catholics to follow the interpretation of the church, and that interpretation is the one contained in First Peter, which is that all men save Noah and his family met their end in the flood. So that's what we can say about the universality of the flood. Did all men really die save Noah and his sons and their wives? Yes. So then, what can we say of the ark? Well, the ark is something interesting. First of all, if you'll read the article that I linked to the Catholic Encyclopedia entry on New Advent, they refer to the ark as being sort of like a box, and this is in keeping with several other flood narratives, like those of the Babylonians. Although they do say that in the Book of Wisdom, it's referred to as a vessel, which could still be a box. Doesn't necessarily contradict. And it will say this encyclopedia entry. It will say that Josephus, among others, will claim that the ship came to rest on Mount Ararat, which is in Armenia. Or sorry, that they located it in Kurdistan, but that tradition places its resting place as Mount Ararat in Armenia. There was a convent built there called the Monastery of the Ark, where a feast was yearly celebrated to commemorate Noah's coming out of the ark after the flood. And actually, this is sort of an enduring element of tradition that the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. And there were actually claims, of course, that people have gone up and actually touched the wood of the ark, for example, that people have seen it. So, for example, I'm taking this excerpt from Josephus it's in chapter 4, I believe, of Flavius Josephus of the Antiquities of the Jews in book 1. So Josephus says, "Now all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood." This is something going back to the 63 or 67 um, different flood myths of this ark, among whom is Berossus the Chaldean. For when he is describing the circumstances of the flood, he goes on thus: "It is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Cordaeans, and that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Hieronymus the Egyptian, also, who wrote the Phoenician Antiquities, and Manasius, and a great many more, make mention of the same. Nay, Nicholas of Damascus, in his 96th book, hath a particular relation about them, where he speaks thus: There is a great mountain in Armenia, over Minyas, called Baris, upon which is reported that many who fled at the time of the deluge were saved, and the one who was carried in the ark came on the shore upon the top of it, and that the remains of the timber were a great while preserved, and this might be the man about whom Moses, the legislator of the Jews, wrote." So these are pagan historiographers, in some instances, that are corroborating the idea that the ark was found on the top of Mount Ararat. Um, so if you look up the Wikipedia page for Mount Ararat, I did, there's really not any that I could find useful information on actual archaeological evidence of the ark. You come across a lot of this stuff where you find articles that say, "Oh, evidence of the ark, archaeological evidence of the ark has been found," and then it's nothing of the sort. But over the years, if you go and you read the Wikipedia page on Mount Ararat, because that's the best I can do, it'll talk about how there were many expeditions over the years funded by different evangelical and millenarian church movements. And I think the article lists something like 200 instances that were reported sightings of the ark, and pieces of the ark were taken, or a piece of the ark was taken away to a museum. But modern archaeologists chalk this up to pseudo archaeology. I don't know about that. Uh, I would have to go to the top of Mount Ararat myself to see whether there is a boat there. And it's like a 16,000-foot mountain. So I don't think I'm climbing it anytime soon. You can believe it for yourself. As for what the church says about the location of the ark, it's inconsequential. We don't really have definitive information about where the ark came to rest, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if it's as ancient of a vessel as people are talking about. It's extremely likely that there might not even be any archaeological evidence for the flood. But anyway, so that's getting historical elements of the flood narrative aside. But what is the spiritual importance of the flood narrative? Like, the historical stuff is important because, there are different ways to read scripture, and in pieces that are meant to be read historically, and I think a lot of Genesis is meant to be read historically, the spiritual meaning of the passage is only deepened by the fact that this is an actual event that took place. But as regards the flood is, and this is several different church fathers will talk about this, so I'm just going to sort of summarize church consensus on this issue. So the flood is a kind of baptism. The flood is used to kill off the wicked men that are proliferating on the earth in the time of Noah. So this is, if you will, sort of a prefigurement of the way that your old wicked self, or your old sinful self, is killed off with the waters of baptism. This is something that Protestant churches, I think, do really well, and maybe this isn't something that's hammered home in Catholic churches, but the power of baptism is that it removes, obviously, original sin. And a lot of the writers in the New Testament, for example, talk about baptism as the death of the old self, the death of the old self, and a coming to life of the new self in Christ. So it's both a death and a rebirth. All of those things are summarized pretty well in the image of the Noahic flood. And then you have the ark itself. Now, so the ark in the Noahic flood can be seen two ways. It can be seen as sort of a proto Ark of the Covenant, which itself is a proto Mary, in a sense. It's a prototype of Mary. So the ark, Noah's ark, right, is the important things of the world, the things that God wants to preserve, are placed into the ark, and they're saved from the waters of the flood. So this is superficially like the Ark of the Covenant, but it's more like a New Testament image, and this is what the church fathers usually connect it to. Is it's more like the New Testament image of the church as a boat. A lot of writers will talk about the church as being a ship or a large vessel, and of course, if you remember the episode, I believe it's in all of the Gospels, or at least it's in three of the Gospels, where Christ is in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, and there's a storm, and Christ calms the storm. So this is sort of like an anti Noah's Ark, right? Is that there's bad weather coming, and Christ, because he's within the boat, is able to calm the storm and to make sure the ship doesn't capsize, right? Um, and you'll also hear Catholic writers, for example, refer to the Catholic Church itself as the bark of Peter. Um, a bark is like a big cargo boat, kind of like the ark. So you see that there's obviously a prototype and fulfilled prototype relationship here between the ark and the church itself. And of course, it's only superficially, but it's worth drawing attention to the fact that it does point to the fact that it is the same word is used, right? It's an ark, and then you have the Ark of the Covenant, which contains uh, the presence of God, and that's how the Hebrews are guided in the desert. So it's almost kind of like a reverse image of Noah's flood, whereas instead of people getting inside the ark to protect themselves from the just wrath of God, it's God putting himself in the Ark of the Covenant to bring mercy to the people. Um, so that you can think of that like the spiritual meaning. I know this has been kind of a rambly episode, and obviously we didn't get to any actual scripture this time, but I thought it would be neat to stop and do a little bit of a pit stop in biblical exegesis. I probably sound terrible because I've been really stopped up lately, and this this is probably not going to be the best episode of this podcast, but I hope to be in business next week when I'm back to school and back into the swing of things. But thanks for bearing with me today, guys. I really enjoy doing the show for you guys, and I hope you've enjoyed. So, for the Hidebound Convivium, this is Colby Anderson signing off.